Thank you. Right, that will be on there. Now you can probably hear me. Great. Thanks very much, Robin, for your kind introduction. And in the second lecture of this afternoon, we're going to be talking about marrying DNA in Irish family tree research. And this can be a major problem because traditionally Irish genealogy has not been very easy to do. Because there aren't records there, because we had the great explosion in 1922 where we lost 800 years of Irish history in the matter of a few seconds. We lost 50% of the Church of Ireland church records. We lost deeds from Christ Church. We lost documents from the 1400s, the 1500s, the 1600s. We lost 4 decades of census information which contained your ancestors. So we lost a huge amount of information, but there is good news on the horizon, and I'm here to give you some good news. So, breaking through brick walls. This would be the typical Irish family tree, and I showed you this in the last one. There's me, my parents, grandparents, and so on, and I've identified half of my great-grandparents, and this is after going through all the usual resources that we have for family history. Today I'm going to be talking largely about the civil registration records, the births, marriages, and deaths, and also the church records, which go back to about 1800, but there's a lot of other records available, and we'll be looking at a few of those during the course of the next 45 minutes or so. And DNA, of course, can help you break through those brick walls. 3 types of DNA we covered previously were the Y DNA, the mitochondrial DNA, and the autosomal DNA, and this has a reach of about 5 to 7 generations, going back to common genetic cousins with whom you share a common ancestor at the level of about your 4 times great-grandparents. So Y DNA and mitochondrial DNA useful for deep as well as recent ancestry, but the autosomal DNA is useful for recent ancestry, which is really what we are most interested in. So the autosomal DNA, the most useful of the 3 tests, it'll take you roughly back to about 1700. Before 1700, the Y DNA will take you back on a single specific ancestral line because it follows the same line as the surname. And that means you either test yourself or you test a cousin with your surname of interest. And I'll show you an example of that during the course of the presentation. But let's start first of all with autosomal DNA, and there are 2 approaches here. The first is you use autosomal DNA to answer a specific question. And it's usually along the lines of, I'm sure we're related to that crowd over there and they have money and you never know when it'll come in handy, and it'd be really useful if we could establish that there was a connection there. When I went to ask my 96-year-old aunt, would you be interested in doing a DNA test? It might help with the family history. Her response was, of course I would. We might find those rich American cousins that went over there 120 years ago. So in this situation, you and someone else have to do the test. And of course, this is a very useful way, of course, of verifying the accuracy of the research you already have done. So if you've spent decades doing your family tree and there's one dodgy connection, you were never quite sure if you got the right record, you could do a DNA test to confirm or refute that the genealogical research you've done is correct. So again, testing 2 people can help answer that specific question. Most of us, however, do a DNA test and it's a fishing trip. We throw our hook into the gene pool and we see what we can catch. So let's first of all look at an example of the specific question. And to answer this and illustrate it, I'm going to talk to you about the mystery of the wedding memento, which was the memento of Ruby Kathleen Gleason. And here you see it here, and she's married to David Patterson, and they're married at Thargomindah on the 23rd of March 1893. And there's some lovely daffodils there. And this fell out of my father's grandfather's papers. So my dad is going through his grandfather's papers. This falls out. He picks it up. He thinks it's a bookmark. And then he looks closely and he finds that it is, in fact, a wedding memento. The only problem is, we have no idea who Ruby Kathleen Gleason is. You know, he says to me, I've never heard of her. I think I'll just put her in the shoebox and put her under the bed. I said, no, don't do that. Let's ask Cousin Liz. So we have lunch with Cousin Liz, and she's there smoking with her cigarette holder. And she says, oh no, she's not one of ours. Put her in the shoebox. Get rid of her. And I'm really not happy with this, so I said, well, before we do that, I'm going to do a little bit of Googling. Let me do a little bit of research and see what I can find. So I go home, sit down in front of my computer, and I'm thinking, okay, Thargomindah, probably an obscure townland in Tipperary. Let's see what I can find. Well, you can imagine my surprise when I find that Thargomindah is in the middle of Australia, teetering on the brink of nothing and surrounded by murderers, poisonous snakes, man-eating koalas, and my personal favourite, sharks with frickin' lasers. So the big question now, well, there are two big questions, was first of all, what the heck was Ruby Kathleen thinking, getting married on the edge of the Australian desert? And what was her wedding memento doing halfway around the world in my grandfather's papers in Dublin? And this started off a wonderful adventure that has come full circle on this particular trip to Australasia. Now, I knew her date of her marriage from the wedding memento, so I sent off for her wedding certificate, and it came back, and I was quite shocked to see that her parents were John and Anne Gleason. Fantastic, I thought, because my great-grandparents are John and Anne Gleason. I mean, how many John Gleasons can there be? They have to be the same people. Well, of course, Anne Gleason that just lived there, not only did she marry a John Gleason, she had a brother called John Gleason, they had a sister called Catherine Gleason who married a John Gleason. So there were 3 John Gleasons in the same family. So you cannot assume anything just because the name looks the same. But Ruby Kathleen was born in Longstone, according to her marriage certificate, and that is the same townland that my great-grandfather Martin and his siblings were born in. They were born in that townland and the 2 adjacent townlands of Shellee and Killascully. So I thought, well, that's an interesting parallel. Now, she says that her father was a hotel keeper on her marriage certificate, a farmer on her death certificate. My John Gleason was a labourer and never set foot in a hotel in his life. So that's where the parallel ends. She was born around 1872, 1869. Martin's siblings were born around about that same period. And I'm just wondering, when I saw this, could the Catherine here have become the Kathleen over here? So again, another tantalizing potential parallel between the 2 stories. We knew from Ruby's death certificate that she came to Australia around about 1886, which was a year after my John Gleason died, and possibly threw the family on destitution. The children had to be farmed off to the 4 corners of the world. We have a family lore on our side that Timothy and Winifred went to Australia, and that Winifred had a daughter who was a concert pianist or a concert singer, something like that. And that's where the parallels ended. And what I did was I put Ruby's family tree together and I put it up on Genes Reunited, and every 3 months I'd go back there and I'd check, is there a match? Does anybody else on Genes Reunited have a Ruby Kathleen Gleason in their family tree? 2 years later, and these things do take time, I did find a match. I found somebody with Ruby Kathleen Gleason in their family tree, and they were able to put me in touch with Ruby's grandson, Alwyn. And Alwyn was in his 80s, and we started communicating by email. I told him family lore from my side of the family. He told me the family lore from his side of the family. That Ruby had actually come over to Australia with an uncle and aunt, and she stayed with them and would visit them from time to time from Thargomindah, which meant taking the Cobb & Co coach to Burke and then the train down to Sydney, and it was a 4-day trip. And she would do this from time to time. In fact, it was on a Cobb & Co coach that she met her husband, David Patterson. And they ended up running one of the Cobb & Co stations in Surat. So he also told me that she had a brother who came over. Just like we had Timothy and Winifred going over, they had a brother who came over soon after or with Ruby, and he left and went off to the US to become a very famous baseball player, and he sent them a watch. And this pocket watch had an inscription on the back of it, and they can't find it. So what that inscription said and what clues it might have given us has been lost to time. But also Ruby had a daughter called Alma, who was an accomplished musician and excelled in the violin. Again, some fascinating parallels between the two family histories. But there was no one piece of evidence that you could put your hand on and say, these two families are definitely related. The John and Ann Gleason on the left are the same as the John and Ann Gleason on the right. So that's when we started talking about DNA. Now here's a wonderful photograph of Ruby Kathleen and my great-grandfather Martin. If the documentary evidence was correct, and it was a big if at this stage, then Martin and Ruby should be brother and sister, meaning that they would share about 50% of their DNA on average. It meant that Jack and Ivy Myrtle May would have been first cousins, and then my dad and Alwyn would be second cousins. So I sent a family tree DNA kit to Alwyn in Australia. It took 6 weeks to arrive. It took 6 weeks for him to do the test. It took 6 weeks for the results to arrive. So that's why I don't have any hair. And finally the results came back, 2.6%. Right within the range of what you would expect for second cousins. And my percentage DNA that I shared with Alwyn was bang in the middle of the average you'd expect for second cousins once removed. So what this DNA test has told us is that Dad and Alwyn are definitely genetically related, and the DNA is saying the best fit is second cousins, and that confirms or supports what the documentary evidence is telling us. It's confirmed the suspected relationship with 99% probability. You can never get 100% probability in genealogy at all. But this is as close as we're going to get. There's still many unanswered questions. Which of the sisters became Ruby Kathleen? Was it Catherine? Was it another sister that we don't know of because we haven't found a record? But certainly Ruby Kathleen has been saved from the shoebox of obscurity. She is not residing under the bed. She is on the shelf in the folder. We found new cousins in Australia, they found new cousins in Dublin, and just 2 weeks ago when I was in Brisbane, one of my third cousins took me to the grave of Ruby Kathleen Gleason, and I'm the first relative from Ireland to visit her since 1886. So it really completes the circle, and I'm just happy that Ruby hasn't been forgotten. She is still remembered to this day. So that's the first use of autosomal DNA. It can help you answer a specific question. Are we here related to them there? It also helps focus your research, because otherwise this wedding memento would have gone under the bed and we wouldn't even have bothered researching this particular line of the family. So it can be a very, very useful tool. But the main way that we use autosomal DNA is the fishing trip. And the fishing trip involves a step-by-step approach to assessing your autosomal DNA matches. And again, there are YouTube videos on my YouTube channel, DNA and Family Tree Research, that will take you through those specific steps. But one of the main secrets of success is to have an online tree. Now, a lot of people don't have online trees. They might have, you might have trees just on your computer at home, on Legacy or some sort of family tree software. You will need to collaborate with people, working with them one-to-one or in small groups, and that means sharing your family tree information, or more specifically, your pedigree information, an ancestral chart with them. And always remember that you don't need to know about the technicalities of DNA to get the maximum use out of it. Because DNA is just a pointer. All it's saying is that you and you're related. Now go away, compare your family trees and find out where the connection is. You will always go back to your family trees. You will always go back to the genealogical data. sharing your pedigree. When somebody emails me these days and says, oh, we're a DNA match and it's on chromosome 17 and I think it's from position, I go, time out. Here's my family tree. Do you see any common locations, common surnames, or common individuals? Because if not, we're back to square one. We are genetically connected, but that's as far as I've been able to get with my family tree. I've characterized the most distant known ancestor on each of my ancestral lines. That's all I know. If you can't find the answer there, then there's not much that I can do to help you. So good luck with your family tree research, and then I put that in what I call the black hole folder, where the email just kind of disappears, and that's probably the last time I'm going to hear from that particular genealogist, unless we find other people that we're more closely related to than we are to each other, and we start a little collaborative group of triangulated matches. And we'll look at triangulation now in a while. But this particular pedigree chart is just generated on Ancestry, and you can even draw this out by hand, take a photograph of it on your iPhone, and just attach that to an email and say, here's my family tree. It's just as good as what you see up here. And you're still asking the same questions. Do you see any common locations between my tree and your tree? Any common surnames, any common individuals? It's as simple as that. But it's important, of course, to characterize each of those most distant known ancestors on each ancestral line of your family tree. And let's look at that using Irish records. So to characterize each of your brick walls, you're looking at your most distant known ancestor, you're looking at birth, marriage, and death records. Trying to find the birth location of your most distant known ancestor is very, very important. Looking for witnesses at the baptisms of their children in particular, because the witnesses, the godparents at the baptism of the children will frequently be a brother or a sister of the most distant known ancestor. And that is important information to know when you're comparing with your matches family tree to see if one of these potential siblings appear in your matches family tree. So these all give clues to look out for when you're comparing your family tree with your matches family tree. And I've developed this strategic approach to Irish records. Here's a timeline up here at the top, 1960 back to 1760. So this is more towards the present day. The civil registration records, births started in 1864 and go up to the present day. Non-Catholic marriages in 1845 up to the present day. Catholic marriages from 1864 up to the present day, and deaths from 1864 up to the present day. How many people here had ancestors living in Ireland after 1864? So there's a few people. How many people had ancestors living in Ireland before 1864? The vast majority. So for those of you who had, the civil records are not going to be any good, because they started after your ancestor emigrated. And for you, it's the church records that are going to be of main use, and these church records come up to the present day, and they go back roughly to about the 1780, 1820 time point. That's when most of them started. But if you're very lucky, some birth records, some church records go back to the 1600s. So anybody have Wexford town ancestors? Right, Mary, your birth, marriage, and death church records may go back to that particular time point, because the Wexford town records are particularly good, and you're nodding to say they did?
Well, I have a family tree which, and I hate to admit this, takes me back to the ancestor who went over with Cromwell.
From Oliver Cromwell?
Yes.
Fantastic. Who of course was never called Oliver Cromwell. Well, he wasn't born Oliver Cromwell, he was born Oliver Williams. But his wife was of higher social status, so he changed his name to Cromwell. And that's another example of that surname and DNA switch. But that's a wonderful heritage to have. And to go back that far is absolutely incredible with documentary records. So that illustrates the point that you can actually go back in Irish records as far as the 1600s. Fabulous. So let's look at a few of these. Now, the civil registration records are free online on Irish Genealogy. Most church records are covered by either Irish Genealogy or Roots Ireland, and we'll look at that. And most of the census information is freely available online, so we'll have a look at that as well. A lot of the links I'm going to discuss in the rest of the presentation are available on Genetic Genealogy Ireland. There is a page there, you see it here on the right-hand side, called Finding Your Irish Ancestors Online Resources. So a lot of the links will be there if you want to check out Genetic Genealogy Ireland. Also on my YouTube channel, I did a similar talk 2 years ago, which is now out of date, called What's New in Irish Records, and you'll find that on my YouTube channel, DNA and Family Tree Research. And the reason why it's out of date is because we have had more records digitized. And this is happening on an ongoing basis because the Irish government is recognizing the power of its diaspora. And it's making a lot of these records available for free online to encourage you all to come back to Ireland and spend your New Zealand dollars. So these are the main websites for online records. Many of them are free. Irish Genealogy, completely free. Ask About Ireland is free. Irish Ancestors is free for the first couple of hits, and then you have to pay €5, which is about, I think, about 10 New Zealand dollars, maybe a little bit more than that. The National Archives down here has a lot of useful resources that are freely available. Family Search is free. Roots Ireland is subscription, so is Find My Past, Ancestry. And Claire Santry's Irish Genealogy Toolkit is a very useful signposting resource. So those are the main websites that I would use for my Irish genealogy research. And the civil registration records are all available for free. And they date from 1845 up until the present day. Mostly on Irish genealogy. They date from 1845 for non-Catholic marriages, 1864 for all the rest, and then births and deaths from 1864. The indexes go up to 100 years ago for births, 75 years ago for marriages, 50 years ago for deaths, very similar to what you have in New Zealand, which is 180-50. So we have an extra 5 years on the Irish records. They're a little bit behind. It should be births up to 1918, but they currently only go up to 1916. It should be marriages up to 1943. They're a little bit behind. They're 2 years behind. And similarly for deaths, they should go up to 1968, but they only go up to 1966. Be aware, 10% of people probably never registered a birth or a marriage or a death. So for example, if you've got ancestors who came from the travelling community, a lot of the time they never bothered registering deaths or births. Similarly, the parish priest will come out and baptise the child in the house, make a little note of it on a scrap, and then when he's going through his pockets 2 weeks later, he goes, "Oh gosh, I never wrote that in the registry book. I can't read my own writing," and he'd make a scribble in the book. So it may very well be that 10% of births, marriages and deaths were never registered. But this is an example of the Irish Genealogy website, and you can see here that I have done a search for somebody called Pence, and there are 3 results. 3 results for Pence, 2 births and 1 marriage. Now I can filter these results by the registration area, Athlone and Dublin, or by the time period, and that can be very helpful for narrowing down. If we click on Jessie Spence, for example, born on the 15th of November 1913, and if we go to the very end and click on Image, then we get this. So this is a digital copy of the page from the registrar's book with Jessie Spence's birth record in it. And you can see she was born on the 15th of November 1913 at 23 Leinster Road West, by the looks of things. Her name was Jessie, she was female. Her father was John Spence, 23 Leinster Road West. Her mother was Annie Spence, formerly Hughes. He was a clerk, father's occupation was a clerk, and the birth was registered by A.P. Hughes, which could be Annie Pence Hughes, or it could be a sister maybe of the mother. She was, the birth was, she was present at birth, 23 Leinster Road West. So that's the kind of information you get there. It's very useful to have other entries above and below, so that if you can't make out this letter here, is that a H and is it Hughes? Then you can look elsewhere on the page and see if there's another example of a H and see if it actually looks like the H that you're seeing here for the mother's maiden name. This is an example of a marriage register entry. This is a photocopy from the General Register Office, which is what you had to use previously. 18th of August 1872, William Spearin marrying Anna O'Toole, full age, bachelor spinster, rank or profession. He is what looks like to be a printer. She is a waistcoat maker. He lives at 160 North King Street. She lives at 6 Little Strand Street. The father's name is Patrick Spearin, who is a porter on the groom's side, and John O'Toole, who is a tailor on the bride's side. You can see that he, or actually is probably Patrick Spearin, is deceased. So that's the kind of information that it gives you. Maybe not as much information as you're used to expecting from New Zealand records, but that's what we work with on Irish genealogy. Now, most of them are available for free on Irish Genealogy, and these are the greens here. And I've divided this diagram into the south of the island and the north of the island, because after 1922, Northern Ireland came into existence, and there's a slightly different strategy for looking for records between the north of the country and the south of the country. For those earlier records, you need to go to the LDS Centre or an affiliated library to get the digital image. The index will still be on the website, but the digital image is not currently on the website, but still freely available from your local affiliated library with the LDS Centre. And of course, the New Zealand Society of Genealogists, their library here in Auckland, also the one in Wellington, also the one in Christchurch, and there's a few other ones around the country where they are affiliated libraries with the local LDS Centre, and so you will be able to get all of the LDS images of these births, there's actually only marriages and deaths. You'll be able to get them from the local NZSG library. So that's where you can get hold of those. And these are just some other sources for civil registration records. Sometimes it's certainly after the cutoff point of 175 and 50, you can find the indexes still for free on Family Search up to 1958 for births, marriages and deaths. Roots Ireland has some that even go up to the 2000s. So I don't know how that crept under the privacy filter, but you can find records up to the 2000s on Roots Ireland website. And then these are some additional web links that you can explore. If you're watching this on YouTube, just pause the video at this point in time and make a note of those hyperlinks. So that's civil registration records. Church records now go up to the present day and go back perhaps as far as about 1800 or thereabouts for most places in Ireland. But they get patchier and patchier the further back you go. And some places in Ireland didn't actually start doing church records until the 1880s. So it is kind of potluck what part of the country your ancestors came from and whether or not there are records available for that particular ancestor. The strategic approach is again something that we use to look at these church records, and like I say, most of them start between 1780 and 1820. So if your ancestor left Ireland sometime between 1820 and 1864, these are the ones you need to look at. Back in 1861, about 78% of the Irish population were Catholic, 12% were Church of Ireland, 9% were Presbyterian, and 1% was Methodist, Jews, Baptists, and Quakers. So you'll see that the majority of records relate to Catholics. Most of these records are found on two websites, Roots Ireland and Irish Genealogy. Irish Genealogy we've seen previously in relation to the civil records. But Roots Ireland covers the majority of the country. Irish Genealogy just covers Dublin City, Cork City and southwest Cork, and then County Kerry. So it has about 2.8 million records, whereas Roots Ireland, which is a subscription website, has about 20 million records. Where you can see that between the two of them, we're looking at something in the region of 23 million records dating back roughly to about 1800. And this is an example of the church records on Irish genealogy. And if we put in the name Pence, like we did previously, then we come up with one baptism, and this is the baptism of Julielmus Moriarty. And Julielmus, of course, is the Latin for William. So for some of these church records, you'll have to brush up on your Latin. Not a difficult thing for most of you, I can tell just by looking at the order. So what is a Pence doing in a record for Julielmus Moriarty? Well, if we actually click on that particular record, it tells us that Julielmus Moriarty had a witness, a godmother, who was Bridget Pence. And that's the great thing about the Irish Genealogy website. If you search for a name, it brings up not just the person who was baptized or married or buried, it brings also up anybody with that name who was a sponsor at a birth, a marriage, or a death, or who was a parent of the person born. So that is Irish genealogy. And then we click on that one and it brings up a little bit more information. You can even view the church register page containing the original record. And if we click on that, it brings you to the original page. And we'll be looking at that in a moment. So that was Irish genealogy. And it just covers those three parts: Dublin City, Cork City, and Southwest Cork, and County Kerry. Only about 2.8 million people. Roots Ireland covers the remainder of the country, the majority of the country. It is subscription based. It's €30 for a month, €15 for a day. Get a month subscription. And set aside a weekend or a whole week where you can blitz your Irish genealogy for €30. And again, the search function is relatively intuitive, and you can put in the surname there, and it comes up with you can filter your search by the father's first name or surname, the mother's first name or surname, and also by the county. And this is a very useful way of actually recreating whole family groups. So if you know that the family name was Doyle, and you know that your most distant known ancestors' parents were Patrick and Bridget, you can put Doyle in the surname box, Patrick in the father's first name, Bridget in the mother's first name, hit enter, and it will show you all the records of all Doyles born to a Patrick and a Bridget. You can then filter it down by county, and you'll be able to hone in on likely family units that include your most distant known ancestors. So that's a very useful way of reconstructing families. The same type of considerations for the marriage record interface, and again you can filter it by a variety of different names of the spouse or the father or the mother. And here is a baptismal record for Pence. This one is called Elizabeth Pence, born in 1840 in County Carlow. If we click on view, it brings up a transcription of the actual record. Elizabeth Pence, her address was Balladerderneen in Bagnallstown. She was Roman Catholic. Her father was John Pence. Her mother was Henrietta Brennan. And if you want to see the actual original, you click on this bottom bit here, which takes you to the digital image of the original parish register. So click on that, and good luck. These were the scribbles that the parish priest did when he was putting the baptisms and marriages up on his register, and that went under the bed at night and then came out the next day whenever there was a baptism. You can see that they're a little bit of a challenge to read. They are not indexed absolutely, they're indexed by the date. So you actually have to go back to the previous slide. The date of baptism, 29th of September, 1840. Okay, I have to scroll down through here by dragging that down until I get to September 1840. Then I have to look for 29th, and then somewhere in this mass of finely written handwriting, I will find the people I was looking for. Just to remind you, it was Elizabeth Pence, born to John Pence and Henrietta Brennan. So they will be written somewhere in there. So those are the church records, and they are fairly comprehensive, and you can be very, very lucky. You can also access a lot of them through Find My Past, and also through Ancestry, which also has a collection of other bits and pieces, because these records were never centralized. They tried to centralize them, and in fact it was only the Anglican Church of Ireland ministers that complied, and a lot of them sent their records up to the Public Record Office where they were to be centralized, but then in 1922 a massive explosion destroyed all of those records that had been sent up. So the ones that didn't send them up were thanking goodness that they hadn't actually done what they were told to do. And thanks to that, a lot of them actually survive. And these are being digitized slowly, the Church of Ireland Anglican records, and you can find out more about them on this Ireland Anglican website, and there is the link just down there. So why is it important to know the names of the children and their order of birth? Because of Irish naming convention. It's another useful pointer. It's not definitive evidence, it is suggestive evidence, and when you get to your most distant known ancestor, you're looking for suggestions. And Irish naming convention, which is probably very similar to Scottish naming convention, the first son was named after the father's father, the second son after the mother's father, third son after the father, the fourth son after the father's eldest brother, the fifth son after the mother's eldest brother, and then the same for the daughters, mother's mother, father's mother, mother, eldest sister, and father's eldest sister. So that means that the parents of your most distant known male ancestor should be the first son and the second daughter for the father's side of the family. And for the mother's side of the family, you're looking at the first daughter and the second son and the first daughter. So if we look at Ruby Kathleen's family, we know that Ruby Kathleen, and there she is there, her parents were John and Anne Gleason. Her older brother was Martin, my great-grandfather, and then she had Bridget, Timothy, Winifred, Honora, Paddy, and Mary. Well, the first son should be named after the father's father. So that should indicate that we're looking for a Martin. John's parents his father was probably Martin. The second son, Timothy, would have been Anne's father, and in fact we have confirmed that both by documentary evidence and by DNA. And we can say definitely that naming convention accurately predicts the mother's father in this situation. The third son, which is Paddy, should be named after the father, but in fact the father is John, so naming convention isn't following the pattern in this instance. But we know that there's 3 Johns in this family anyway. Are they saying, let's just skip John and go on to the fourth one? And that would suggest that if they are doing that, then Paddy should be the father's eldest brother. So I'm looking out for a Paddy who might be the father's eldest brother. On the daughter's side, the first daughter, which was Ruby Kathleen herself, and her real name was Catherine when she was baptized, that certainly does fit in with the mother's mother, and we've confirmed that again by documentary evidence. The second daughter, which is Bridget, should be John's mother, but we haven't been able to confirm that yet with documentary evidence. And the third daughter, which is Winifred, she should be named after the mother, but in actual fact, the mother is Anne. So once again, are they skipping this third step in the naming convention and going on to the fourth step? And as it turns out, in fact, Anne did have an elder sister called Winifred. So maybe that's what they're doing. And families didn't always stick to the naming convention. They adapted naming convention to suit their own particular needs. So be aware of that. Also be aware of this. There is a 4-year gap between children at that particular time point, whereas there was a 2-year gap between every other child. This is why it's important to get the order of the children correct. Somebody in Wellington suggested that there could have been an extra child born there. Maybe there were twins born there. Maybe one was a John and the other one was an Anne. And that would now put us back on the standard use of naming convention. So, something to think about. But certainly naming convention can help you build a potential family beyond your brick wall. And that's going to be very important when it comes to comparing your family tree with your DNA matches family tree. So that's characterizing each of your brick walls in your family tree. That's the strategic approach to Irish records. There are other records we can use, like the census, Griffith's valuation, the directories, gravestones, wills, probates, newspapers, and I've written about that in this supplement to Tracing Your Ancestors, which is a well-known series of magazines. You can get it online for $8.50 US, and if you just search for that, then you should be able to find it. It's called Tracing Your Ancestors, Irish Research, A Practical Guide. And I spend a lot more time going through each of these record sources and using a strategic approach for your particular Irish ancestry. There's other websites I want to mention as well that are very, very useful for helping signpost you towards the direct source for particular Irish records. John Grenham is probably the doyen of Irish genealogy, and he is very, very useful on his website, Irish Ancestors. He also has an associated blog, so do check out johngrenham.com. It's a very, very useful website, lots of resources there. We've talked previously about Claire Santry's Irish Genealogy Toolkit, and that's very helpful as well. And she also has a book and a booklet that looks at the more recent Irish records. Facebook can be a great place to get support and help, because now there is a Facebook group for virtually every single county in Ireland. So do check out Facebook, and specifically for the county that you're interested in. There are usually several hundred, if not several thousand people that are members of each of these Facebook groups, and they will do lookups for you. They will look up the local records if you ask nicely. Also, there is the Irish Genealogy News website, which is the blog that is run by Claire Santry. We also have the Genealogical Society of Ireland and the Irish Genealogical Research Society. Both of them are very active research family history societies in Ireland. Another organisation which is packed full of volunteers is Ireland Reaching Out. And they want to reach out, grab you, and bring you back to Ireland to spend your New Zealand dollars. So they have an army of volunteers that will actually help you, and again, it's on a parish level. So they'll help you with the local history for your particular area of interest. So do check out Ireland XO, Ireland Reaching Out. One of the very useful things that we do with DNA is triangulation, and I mentioned it briefly in the last presentation, but we've been using triangulation for millennia. And here you see two people on this bank of the river looking across the river, triangulating on a tree in the distance. So they're using geometry and trigonometry to find out how far away is this tree? How distant is it? And we're doing the same kind of thing with genealogy. Here we are in the present, and we're looking at an ancestor in the distant past and triangulating on that ancestor. And to make a triangle, you need two people in the present and one person in the past. And here's an example from my own family tree. There's me, there's my dad, and this is the pathway up to my great-great-great-grandparents, Patrick Spearin and Mary Morgan. A few years ago, I realized that several of my dad's cousins had tested. And if we look at them, they all triangulate. And you can see the lovely triangles that they're forming there. They all triangulate on Patrick Spearin and Mary Morgan. And what this means is I can look at the matches that they share with each other. Because any matches they share with each other, it will be DNA that has been passed down to them via Patrick Spearin and Mary Morgan. And the DNA that they share with their matches has to have come down through Patrick Spearin and Mary Morgan, it might be on the Spearin side of the family, or it might be on the Morgan side of the family. I cannot tell at this stage, but it has to come down through one or the other. So what I did was I looked at these 4 cousins, let's call them A, B, C, D, and I compared cousin A with cousin B, A with C, A with D, B with C, B with D, C with D, and this is what I got. I looked at all the permutations, these combinations, these pairwise combinations, and this was the number of shared matches they had with each other. It was, when I put them into a spreadsheet and removed the duplicates, I had 100 shared matches between any 2 of these 4 cousins, all of whom descended from this distant ancestral couple. And I wrote 100 individual emails to each of these people, and I said, you match at least 2 of my 4 cousins, which means you're related either via my Spearin line or my Morgan line. Do you have any Spearin ancestors? Do you have any Morgan ancestors? And that's all I asked. And I got 49 responses saying no, 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 and a response rate of 49 out of 100 is not bad. But the 50th response said yes. And I said, fantastic. And they said, we have a John Morgan in our family. Because on this gravestone, you can see that it was erected by John Morgan in fond remembrance of his dearly beloved wife, Mary, who died in 1879, aged 78 years. She would have been born about 1800. And I'm assuming that her husband, John Morgan, was born about 1800 as well. And I said, well, that's fantastic, because my Mary Morgan, my great-great-great-grandmother, was born around about 1800. Perhaps my Mary and their John were brother and sister. So I said, well, can I see your tree online? They said, we haven't started it yet. So guess who did their family tree? So I had to build their family tree, and we spent months and months back and forth, and I couldn't find how John Morgan on their side connected with Mary Morgan on my side. So it went into the shoebox, it went under the bed, and then 2 years later, I got the 51st response. And that opened a can of worms. Because the 51st response was a new DNA match. It was another Morgan ancestor. They even had a photograph of this Morgan ancestor. And here he is, Patrick Morgan, dressed in his finery of the Royal Irish Constabulary. And he was born around about the same time, 1812 or so, maybe a little bit afterwards. There was a rumour in this family that these Morgans had links to Wales. And of course, Morgan could be a Welsh name, could also be a native Irish name. O'Muirachán became Morgan, anglicised to Morgan. So I was never sure whether my Morgans were Irish or Welsh, but this particular family had a rumour of a link to Wales. So I took out all the old research and I started looking through it again. I started Googling, and I found a family tree online. And here's the family tree. And I was amazed that, look, there's Patrick Morgan, born in 1812. This tree has his parents. I thought, fantastic. I'll be able to tell this person that we've been able to push his line back an extra generation. So that's good news to start off with. And as I looked along the siblings, I saw, oh, look, there's a John Morgan. Oh, and he's married to a Mary. Could this be the John and Mary Morgan on the gravestone? Well, that would be really good, because then we have their parents as well. And then I looked further along, and that's when I fell off my chair. Because there were my great-great-grandparents, Patrick Spearin and Mary Morgan. I said, well, this is fascinating. I must check the sources. No sources. I can't tell if this tree is accurate or just wishful thinking. And it was put up by the owner in 2013. So I'm thinking, gosh, this is an old family tree. If I send them an email, I'm probably not going to get any reply at all. But I sent an email, and I was annoyed, so it was fairly curt, and I just simply said, why do you have my great-great-grandparents in your tree? What is the meaning of it? How do you explain yourself? And I thought, well, they'll get that in 2 years' time. Well, I was shocked when 3 days later I got a response which says, I have Professor Waddell's notebooks from 1906. So, wow, a response. And who is Professor Waddell? Oh, he is Professor of Military History in Trinity College Dublin from 1890 to 1915, and in the early 1900s he did a complete survey of the Morgan surname in Ireland, using all the wills and all the records that went up in flames in 1922 when we lost 800 years of primary sources. And he'd written it down in his notebooks. But also, he also documented the claim of the Irish Morgans to the baronetcy of the Morgans of Tredegar in Wales. And here are his notebooks. There are my great-great-grandparents, and I discovered that Patrick Spearin was born in Ballingarry, County Limerick. I never knew that before. So I thought, fantastic. I've managed to actually use DNA to find somebody with a rare source of information that pushes my family tree back an extra generation. How wrong I was. They pushed it back 5 generations to Limerick in the 1600s. But not only that, the link to Wales brought us back to the Morgans of Tredegar, who go back to 1031. And they are related to 5 kings, 6 lords, and a duck. I think they meant duke, but they spelled duck back then. I mean, it could have been a duck. I do tend to waddle from time to time. But not only that, oh, hold on, I need to show you my new house. This is Tredegar House in Wales, where there's wonderful ballroom. I've been there. I had to drive up for 2.5 hours, attend a lecture, and drive back. They were very, very nice up there, until I told them I owned the place. And they're in the Dictionary of Welsh Biography, and they've got a website online, and there are scandals of Tredegar House. Oh, good. Ancestors in the closet just bursting to get out. I couldn't believe my luck. And the pedigree went back to my 472nd grandfather. I don't know his surname. Apparently he was very fond of boats. And it was a pedigree of the Morgan family from Noah down to Sir William Morgan, who was knighted in 1612, and this was made out in about 1825. So this was something I found in the Family History Library in Salt Lake City on a visit there last year. And I couldn't believe that they went that far back. But I also couldn't believe that also descended from the Morgans of Tredegar House is somebody called Captain Henry Morgan, a well-known privateer and buccaneer who became governor of Jamaica, and he had slave plantations. So now I have slave owners as relatives, and that entire narrative has to be assimilated into my family tree, and I have to deal with that. I'm also related to this person here. Any ideas? J.P. Morgan. I should be worth a fortune. Morgan Chase. I'm also related to this person here. I am the 11th cousin of Princess Diana, who is descended from the same William Morgan who did that pedigree back in 1612. I should have been at the wedding in May, but I had to come here instead. So you never know what you're going to find, and this is a wonderful example of how, if you persevere long enough, you will open the treasure chest and you'll get lots of very useful information. The person that has the family Bible, the person that has letters in the attic that actually take you back in time further than you could ever have possibly imagined. Now, of course, I have to double check all the facts for this particular connection. As my dad says, don't let the truth get in the way of a good story. And certainly is a fantastic story. But I will have to go back and just see how accurate this all is. But so it's created a huge amount of work for me. But it's just wonderful to think that I could be connected to such interesting people. Now, shall I stop there, or shall I go on very briefly for 5 minutes? 5 minutes? 5 minutes, okay. The autosomal DNA will take you to 1700 more or less. Beyond 1700, you need to do the Y DNA, but you need to choose the cousin who still bears the family name of interest. So I was very interested in my Spearin family, and the Spearin Surname Project is available as a website. It's also a family tree DNA project, and it was the first surname I started researching because it was unusual, S-P-I-E-R-I-N, Spearin. So a very unusual spelling of this particular surname. And I found a chap who was researching the Spearin surname, and I wrote to him. I found him online. I wrote to him on his email address, and he said, well, he sent me 4 pages in response. I think you're related to these 4 cousins, because we have the 2 brothers. We have the wills of Matthew and Luke Spearin, which go back to the 1600s, and from these we were able to build this pedigree of the early Limerick Spearins, and the Spearins married the Hartwells, who were mayors of Limerick, and they called their children Hartwell Spearin. And these Hartwells were mayors of Limerick because they'd been granted land as a result of their fighting on the part of Charles I and against Cromwell, and we have 24 of our 236 branches in the Spearin DNA project have Hartwell Spearin as ancestors in their list of descendants. And there is a sliver of information written by the Chief Herald that links these Limerick Spearins to Spearins in London, where there were goldsmiths. They were involved in the plantation of Ulster in 1609. And they lived on Leadenhall Street, right underneath the Gherkin. And there's also a link to Cambridge, where they were granted a license to print by King Henry VIII in 1534 and became one of the first 3 printers of the Cambridge University Press. And then there were links back to Antwerp in modern-day Belgium, where apparently one of these printers was best friends with Erasmus, who was Europe's leading philosopher. And I thought, well, what a fantastical story. This couldn't possibly be true. I told my dad, and he said, well, I might be related to Erasmus, but you're definitely not. So what we did, we started the Spearin surname project. And I thought, oh, this sounds good. We'd just see, just using DNA, if all these different Spearins around the world are related to each other. But my Y DNA is not Spearin, it's Gleason. I go back, my Y DNA goes back Gleason, 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 Gleason. So what I had to do is I had to trace back my Spearin ancestors to my great-grandfather Patrick Spearin, who married Mary Morgan, and I had to trace all his living descendants until I found a direct male line where the Spearin Y DNA would have been passed down to the present day. That was my 3rd cousin. He agreed to do a Y DNA test, and we put it onto family tree DNA. And initially, and here you see we had 4 volunteers. So initially 4 people tested, and you can see they have different surname variants. Spearing, Spearin with 2 E's, and then Spearin with an E and an A. And they all go back to Limerick, and here are the results. And you can see that there's only a small mutation here and a small mutation here. The rest of their DNA markers were identical. Well, I fell off my chair when I saw this, because I didn't expect this at all. How could these very different surname variants be related to each other? In fact, they were practically exact matches, indicating they shared a common ancestor sometime in the last, 500 years or so? So more people tested, but the first lesson was you're all closely genetically related. Beware of surname spellings, it can be misleading. And lesson number 3, the most important, you're on the right track. Keep researching. DNA is pointing us and focusing our research. It's pointing us in the right direction. So more people tested, and they were all almost virtually identical to the people that had been there initially. And my cousin, he tested as well, and I came as an exact match to the people that had been tested, indicating that all of us, with these various different spellings of the surname Spearin, we were all genetically related sometime in the last couple of 100 years, and we all went back Limerick, 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 Limerick. Our most distant known ancestor all went back to Limerick. So now we can reasonably say that any Spearin or Spearing who can trace their ancestry back to Limerick is probably a close genetic match to everyone in this particular group, genetic family 1. And when we look at the documentary evidence, and this is where your genealogy and DNA overlap, the evidence that suggests a relationship between these different people included that the different surnames could be variants of each other. We've seen that. There's similar forenames in the different families. Nicholas was very common in this group of families. William was very common. Luke, a quite rare forename, was very common among this group of families. And here you can see here the Canadian family, the Dublin family, the New Jersey family, Limerick family here. These are from all over, and this is the most distant known ancestor in each of these families, and then these are the early Limerick Spearans back here. And this is the present day, this is back in the 1600s. So that's just a summary of the various family trees. The many brick walls all go back to the same general area of Limerick. And early Limerick Spearans were present in the same area in 1719. So these ones up here also were in Limerick. So everything's pointing in the same direction. And most importantly was the persistence of the Hartwell-Spearan combination in present-day trees. And I'll show you exactly where that is. So the conclusion so far is that the Hartwell forename links the members of Ontario Family 1 with everybody else. And here's Hartwell-Spearan back in the 1600s. Here's Hartwell-Spearan. Here's Charles Hartwell-Spearan, George Hartwell-Spearan, and there's a few others within that particular family. So you see how this unusual combination of surnames has persisted throughout the generations. DNA confirms that all families are related. We all share a recent common ancestor. All the families that are genetically related to the Ontario family can piggyback onto the longest genealogy and jump back across the generations back to Limerick. Further questions, there are still 3 to 4 missing generations here between these early Limerick Spearans and the most distant known ancestor of the current trees. But it is actually still pointing us in the direction of future research. Can we link the Limerick Spearans to the London Spearings? We need to find descendants of the London Spearings, test them, and see if they match our Limerick group. Can we link to the Cambridge Spearings and the first printer of the Cambridge University Press and the friend of Erasmus? We will need to have Cambridge Spearings to do the test. And can we even go back to Flanders and Antwerp in the 1400s? We need Dutch and Belgian Spearings and Spearings to do the DNA test and see if there is a genetic link. That is the aim of ongoing research, but you can see how the Y-DNA has actually pointed us in a very specific generation beyond that 1700 time point where autosomal DNA runs out, and we're on yet again another wonderful adventure. Thank you very much. I don't know if we have time for any questions.
Here's a couple.
Couple of questions.
Yes, Carl.
On the death certificates, the early ones prior to the ones that are available online, can you go somewhere, if I'm going to Waddell, can I go somewhere to cite those actual certificates, those entries?
Do you want to get a digital copy of the actual death certificate?
I've got 2 twins that were born, they're the last of the family before they came to New Zealand. They don't arrive in New Zealand, they die. I found what are possibly the death of the 2 twins in South Dublin, but I want to know who the informant was to see whether they are my twins.
What year did they die?
One died in 64 and the other died in 65, and then the family came to New Zealand in 66.
1964, 1965.
18.
1864, 1865. Right, okay, those death, you can get the digital image here.
Because they're not available on your thing, it doesn't show those early ones are not available.
They're available from New Zealand Society of Genealogists Library here in Auckland, because they're an affiliated library with the LDS, and the LDS have the original digital image available on computer, so you should be able to go there.
Showed that those ones in yellow are only available around about 1870 onwards.
They're only available on the website, the irishgenealogy.ie website. But that yellow bit, those yellow ones are available via the LDS.
Before those yellow ones?
Before those yellow ones, there won't be any death certificates, because death certification started in 1864. So you might be lucky to find your twins in the death records, the civil death records, if they died from 1864 onwards, but before 1864 they won't be available. But if they are available, then they should be available on the Irish Genealogy website as an index.
Yeah, I found the two of the index.
All right.
I want to know, can I actually see the entries?
Yes, you can. And you can see them here in Auckland. So you need to go to the library, New Zealand Society of Genealogists Library, log on to the Latter-day Saint website from the library, and you will be able to access those digital images of the original death register entry, including who the informant was. Cool. Question here?
I just wanted to share an anecdote about the Clifford family surname. There are 25 different branches over many decades of research. In the year 2003, we did a Y chromosome study with University College London, and they found that 6 of the 25 different family trees of Clifford's related. The others had adopted the name at different times. You can't get too enthusiastic about the surname.
Sure, absolutely. And in fact, there are many reasons for why you can have this surname or DNA switch. We talked about Oliver Cromwell. He wasn't born Oliver Cromwell, he was born Oliver Williams, but he took his wife's name because she was of higher social status. So his direct paternal line, his direct male line, will go Williams, 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 Cromwell, 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 Cromwell. So there will be a surname switch there, and the Cromwell name will become associated with Williams' Y DNA. That happens about 1% to 2% per generation. It's not just because your wife is of higher social status. It could be an adoption, an illegitimacy. It could be a widow, a young widow remarries, and her young children take on the name of the second husband, but carry the Y DNA of the first husband. So there's a lot of many different reasons for why this surname or DNA switch may occur. And if you think that it's about 30 generations back to when the surname first started being used, and there's a 1% to 2% chance per generation, then 30 generations will be 30 to 60% chance, and I round it around to 50% chance. There's a 50% chance that your surname that you carry today does not go back to the person who originated it, because there will have been a surname or DNA switch at some point along the way. So when people think, oh, the Y DNA shows that this isn't my family tree at all, I say be very careful what you wish for, because maybe half of your ancestral lines don't go back to whom you think they should. All of us have a genealogical family tree, which is absolutely valid, and a genetic family tree, which is absolutely valid. And I like to have both of them, because the more the merrier. Any other questions?
Right, well, I would like to call on Vivian to thank Morris on behalf of the Silver.
Morris, thank you so much for today's entertainment.
Pleasure.
I'm not quite sure if I'm entertained, overwhelmed, underwhelmed, because I still can't find my Derry family. I have discovered, though, that his family in the Goldsmiths built new buildings, which is where my family were in Derry, so there's hope yet that we might go this way.
We might even be related.
So we'd really like to accept these from the NZSG. Thank you so much. And we know that you've enjoyed your stay, so there's another bottle of red before you go.
Thank you, Vivian, and thank you, Morris. That was absolutely wonderful. 2 wonderful talks, and I know that everybody's really enjoyed them. And I just want to say at the conclusion is that our next meeting is on Saturday the 14th of July, and we have Deborah Wilkinson-Gray who will talk on Where's the Password, and it's to talk about how significant people in your life need to tidy up their affairs, us included, me included as well. And she has had this experience when her husband died and the issues that arose for her. So I think that's actually a really important thing to learn about. So that's our next meeting on Saturday the 14th of July. And I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and thank Morris especially for his wonderful talks today. Thank you.